While the Democrats were debating in Miami, President Trump in the international spotlight in Japan at the G20 summit, although on Twitter, he's made it pretty clear he's watching the debates as well. Earlier today, he sat down with Russian President Vladimir Putin for their first in-person meeting since Robert Mueller wrapped up his investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. The president asked about whether he'll ask Putin not to interfere in the election here in the U.S. Take a listen. President Trump called the meeting with Putin a, quote, great honor, and he voiced optimism ahead of a meeting tomorrow with China's President Xi Jinping.
We look forward to it. I think it'll be productive, and who knows, but I think it'll be productive. At a minimum, it will be productive. We'll see what happens and what comes out of it.
Joining us from Boston to weigh in on tomorrow's meeting is Dr. Christopher Smart, Chief Global Strategist at the Barings Investment Institute. Great to have you on today. So the president, what did he say, productive 3 times in that? So clearly he sees some room to maneuver going into this meeting. How would you define success coming out of it?
Well, I think success is sort of meeting the expectations that he set, and clearly they are much higher expectations than his tweets from, I guess it was about 6 or 8 weeks ago, when he sort of walked away from the table announcing that the Chinese had been backpedaling, which is sort of not unusual behavior for these kinds of trade negotiations in the very late stages. But it feels right now as if both sides are eager to strike some sort of a temporary truce, even as a lot of the larger issues have come center stage and are going to be a real part of the conversation between Washington and Beijing, not just over the next months, but over the next years and decades.
There's been some conflicting narratives going into this meeting. Yesterday, we had that Wall Street Journal report that seemed to suggest China had some big demands going into the meeting. And then you heard Larry Kudlow come out and say there are no preconditions on the table. Is this just posturing going ahead of this, or can we read into any of these reports coming out in terms of what has actually been discussed in advance of this meeting?
Well, I suspect what's been discussed is what has been on the table from the very beginning, how China will stop the forced transfer of technology, what measures it will take to open up its markets to U.S. firms. And in particular, I guess what is particularly important to the president is doing something to redress the trade deficit. But these have been on the table for a long time. I don't expect the problem will be solved or there will be a signed agreement. More likely than not, there will be teams will be instructed to reengage on the parameters of a broad outline. On the one side, perhaps we will, not be imposing new tariffs. Maybe we will take off some of the tariffs. On the Chinese side, there will be commitments to enshrine some of these in regulations or laws, which have been part of the sticking points. The big question that will probably remain unresolved is what to do about Huawei, which, as you know, is a very difficult issue for both sides to solve, and that will likely take a lot more time.
Yeah, Dr. Smart, Dan Roberts here. I was going to ask you about Huawei specifically because you mentioned the tech transfers and the IP, and that has been an issue for a while. And yet the narrative has really shifted, I think, and focused in to become about this one company. Remember, it feels like so long ago already that ZTE was in the crosshairs, but now all anyone talks about is Huawei. Do you think that really could become just the only sticking point left? We had reports a few days ago that previously the two sides had been 90% of the way there. But one thing I keep saying on our live shows is, well, clearly that 10% is of outsized importance, and it sounds like maybe that whole 10% is about Huawei.
Well, 90% is still 90%, and the thing any trade negotiator will tell you is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So there are a lot of different levers back and forth and interlocking strings on all of these issues. I think what is most likely going forward, what it seems as if we're hearing from both sides, is that Huawei will kind of be set aside. Maybe on our side, the president will dial down the pressure on Huawei, allow some sorts of transactions, limited transactions to take place, which will allow China to move forward on some of these other trade issues. But technology transfer, the security of telecommunications infrastructure, the security of 5G networks, both in the United States and Europe and around the world, are going to be a key point of friction between the U.S. and China over many, many years. And I think setting it aside is the best we can hope for to sort of secure agreement in the short term again on the tariffs that are in place.
Okay, we'll be watching with that meeting set to take place later tonight here in the U.S. Saturday over in Japan. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure.